Thank you, Stephen, and thank you to IDC for organizing this. And thank you also for the introduction that asks us to think about the questions that we're talking about with the Christians of Turkey as they relate to the upcoming 2023 parliamentary and presidential elections. Because I think what you're asking us to think about is this critical juncture in Turkish politics and geopolitics as it relates to the way forward for the Christians of Turkey. And although your question to me on the face of it may seem like an abstract theoretical question for academics dealing with history, in fact, I think you're reminding us of the importance of history in actively framing the possibilities, and by that I mean both constraints and enablers for concrete policy design and choices and decisions. And I think it's important for us to point out that until now, history and historiography have been instrumentalized and popularized in Turkey in ways that have limited the possibilities for Turkish political elites to build policies that are informed by the logics of inclusion and pluralism. And that has been nearly fatal for the survival and sustainability of the country's religious minority communities. And by that, I mean numerical minority communities. So I take, very seriously that this is a moment for policymakers to escape what historians call, the disease of short-termism. In other words, thinking only in terms of short-term historical episodes and not thinking about the long durée of history as it relates very actively to policymaking. So I'll start with some general comments and go to some specific comments and be mindful of time as well. In terms of general comments, I think it's important for us when we think about the Turkish state and how it's seen history and the ecumenical patriarchate and Greek Orthodox Christians of Turkey. The Turkish state in general has been no different than any other state in developing an official history that was dedicated to the project of nation building and to the ideology of nationalism. So to defining who's a legitimate citizen of Turkey, what are the criteria for legitimacy, and also to articulating then the legal, sociopolitical, and religio-cultural logics for citizenship. So in that regard, the Turkish state looks like other states. Secondly, I think it's important as a general observation to point out that Turkish state makers fully understood historiography, the writing of history, as an explicitly political project that had to address the reality of the country's Christian populations, and most specifically that had to address the country's Greek Orthodox Christians and ecumenical patriarchate. That was the largest remaining Christian community after the Ottoman genocide against Christians and after the population exchange organized under the Treaty of Lausanne. And that was also the community that was understood by the Turkish state as the inheritors of, or the remnants of, the Byzantine Empire, on whose foundations the Ottoman Empire had been built. And finally, by virtue of its organic connections to Hellenism, to Greek thought and language, the ecumenical patriarchate was associated by Turkish state makers with the wars of nationalism that led to the breakup of the Ottoman Empire. So the politics of writing history for the new Turkish state under Kemalist leadership, but that's continued up to the present in the Erdoganist period, has been very consistent in viewing the ecumenical patriarchate and the Greek Orthodox community as both a domestic political problem and a foreign policy geopolitical problem that has to be interpreted, managed, and instrumentalized, and from a maximalist perspective, either absorbed and appropriated or disappeared and erased. So in shorthand terms, this has meant that two things. The conquest motif has been dominant in two ways. First of all, number one, the ecumenical patriarchate and Greek Orthodox Christians are seen as remnants of the Byzantine Empire that was conquered by the Ottomans. And so the conquest trope, we've seen its ubiquitousness in the last year with the reversion of Hagia Sophia to active mosque status, but it's everywhere around in Istanbul as well, with the term Fatih being associated with structures, sites, and areas of Istanbul that were explicitly related to the Byzantines' religious and cultural institutional structures. And then secondly, that conquest motif has implied both inferiority and suspicion when it comes to the ecumenical patriarchate and Greek Orthodox Christians. After all, the community is inferior because it was conquered. It was conquered because of the superiority of Islam and ethnic Turkish identity, and it was suspicious by virtue of being non-Sunni Muslim, non-ethnically Turkish, and most especially by virtue of its shared religion and ethnicity with the neighboring Greek state. So this is the kind of general historiographical framework in which the experience of the ecumenical patriarchate and Greek Orthodox Christians has played itself out in Turkey. Moving on just to see how consequential that historical interpretation and instrumentalization has been, I'll give three very brief examples. Continuing on with the writing of history: one, religious freedom policy; number two, and cultural heritage policy; number three, all of which take us back to where we started, the impacts on building a democratic Turkey or moving away from democracy towards an authoritarian Turkey. So in terms of each of these more specific examples, in terms of historiography, and you can see how, powerfully this trope of conquest with suspicion and inferiority plays itself out. In terms of historiography, Kemal and Turkey's early state makers, they built actually purposefully a cross-disciplinary cadre of state-supported professional intellectuals who were dedicated to a new national identity project. It's called the Turkish Historical Thesis, and it was developed in the Turkish Review of Anthropology. And I think it's useful to go back and read some of that journal. It was an academic journal published from 1925 to 1939 by the University of Istanbul's Faculty of Medicine and Anthropology Institute. And the raison d'etre of the institute was to promote this new Turkish historical thesis that combined eugenics, that drew on eugenics to posit the superiority of what was called the Turkish race. And here, a quote I think is very instructive. In the 1930s, the then Minister of Justice in Turkey referred to, I'll read the quote. It was published in a journal. He referred to Greeks, Jews, and Armenians who, while living there for a long time, were the descendants of a mongrel race who were not genuine Turks and could only have one right in the Turkish fatherland, that is, to be a servant and a slave. Now, I think the quote is instructive, not because of what it communicates and the terms that it uses, but most importantly for our purposes of democratization and inclusion, it highlights the second-classness of Greeks, Jews, and Armenians in this case. It highlights that they have been conquered and that they are inferior. And so that kind of historiographical project has been disseminated and internalized in civil society in ways that are actively and passively displayed towards those communities. So that's one example. And I cite that because, again, we tend to think that there's no connection between history and policy. And yet there are very active and deliberate connections in Turkey as well as around the world. The second example, specific example, would be, and please flag me when I get to 3 minutes if I'm not already there, because I want to be respectful of time. The second example would be in terms of religious freedom policy. So we know that the right of religious institutions and communities to self-govern means no coercive interference in the internal functioning of those communities. But we know that where the ecumenical patriarchate is concerned, property confiscations and certainly the now just completed 50-year closure of the Greek Orthodox Theological School of Halki has been at odds with that kind of internal governance, free governance. And then finally, in terms of cultural heritage policy, which I know we'll hear a lot about now, the renaming of so many patriarchal sites in Istanbul, churches, associated hospices and hospitals, under the rubric of Fatih conquest, I think is instructive. And most recently, the semiotics of the new mosque in Taksim, whose size and location obscure the sightlines of the large patriarchal Ayet Riyada church in the area, with prayers on May 28th, the day before May 29th. the fall of Constantinople, conquest, reinforce that motif in semiotics. And I think I probably have only 30 seconds left. What to do and why does this matter? I think all of these points are critical for Turkey's Democrats, activists in the political class and in civil society who are committed to moving beyond this kind of hackneyed dichotomy of Kemalist secular democracy and Erdogan as Islamist authoritarianism, because where the country's Greek Orthodox community are concerned, but the other religious minorities are concerned, there's been a continuity there. So easy things to do: change the discourse, renegotiate, for example, the Cultural Heritage MOU that was signed by the US and Turkey on January 19th, 2021, in a way that redefines historical and geographical parameters of membership in the country's rich, pluralist national identity. Two, reopen the Halki Theological School as an independent school under the independent governance of the Ecumenical Patriarchate, and don't use citizenship or visa requirements as coercive tools. And three, look at cultural heritage management as part of human rights and religious freedom policy in order to address ways that sites can be points of sharing and points of respect rather than points of instrumentalization and weaponization. Thank you very much.